passage for today comes from Luke chapter 6, verses 20 to 36. And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful." This is the word of God.
We are in part 4 of our series on mercy. And last week, we looked at this really extraordinary passage, which some people call the Lucan version of the Beatitudes. And we wrestled with this difficult word, this word that utterly flips the world upside down. Blessed are you, or happy are you, if you're poor, or if you're hungry, if you're weeping and you're rejected for the sake of Jesus. But woe to you if you're rich, if you're filled, if you laugh, and everybody thinks you're so great. And that's what we talked about last week. And we're going to move on into this next passage. And the reason I thought it was so important, I'm going to really spend the bulk of the time in this latter portion of the passage, but that it was important that we rehear last week's message, because I don't think you can understand this word properly unless you understand it in light of last week's word. Unless you understand how much that there is a kingdom that Jesus is breaking into the world that really flips the values of the world upside down. Right? And so today's message I've entitled Radical Generosity and the Kingdom of God, and in 3 parts. Part 1, competing values from a different kingdom. Right? Competing values from a different kingdom. In part 2, spiritual poverty and the character of kingdom mercy. Spiritual poverty and the character of kingdom mercy. And I will close with a word about the radically merciful Father. The radically merciful Father. Now, we're looking at these commands that Jesus tells us to do. I mean, love your enemies, be good to those people who don't like you, and especially there's a lot of social. There's a lot of barriers in our culture, and there's differing tribes, ethnicities. There's political division in our culture. And there's a lot of application about that from these words. But I'm especially interested in what he says next. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish others would do to you, do so to them. And then he goes on to say these things. You should love those who don't love you. If you only love those who love you, well, I mean, that's not really any different than all the other regular sinner folks out there. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. So here it is. There's this whole understanding of the way the world typically tends to work. We should do, usually good to those people who are good to us. And those people who hate us, we hate them. And we lend to those people because we expect to get something back from them. But then Jesus tells us this completely, let me just stop, just for a moment, just think about what he's saying. Please try to stop for a moment and don't think about this as a religious text. And you're a Christian and you're supposed to believe this, right? But just think about what he's actually saying. What he's actually saying is completely insane. It's, I can imagine if you're a person who would walk into this room today and you don't know anything about the Bible and you don't, I don't believe in this Jesus stuff. So what is it that they actually teach here in this church? And, they read this text and like, are you kidding? I'll give you a little illustration. When I think of this, I think one of the things that we have to think about is not just whether what Jesus is saying is just strange or weird or, because we're Christians, we're supposed to accept it. But really what he's saying is he's telling us how to operate in a wholly different kingdom. That kingdom has a totally different set of values. Let's put it this way, it has a different culture. Different culture with different values and just a whole different approach toward money or for your enemies or for what you get from other people. What you can, we interact with these people because, there's something good that you're going to get out of interacting with these people. But the kingdom that he's from, it doesn't think like that. The people who are from that kingdom, they just operate in a wholly different way altogether, with a whole different set of values. Imagine, you take something that we're very familiar with, and someone from another culture comes in and then approaches this thing that we do, whether you give money to the poor or whether we lend someone money, and then how they approach it. And but they do it in a very weird way with a totally different culture's mentality and approach to it. And the picture I thought of was many years ago. It's not that many years ago. We're talking in the 1990s. There was a pitcher who rose up in the ranks and made it to the major leagues. And his name, and some of you, since many people in this circles are from Korean American background, you might have heard of him. Even if you're not a baseball fan, his name is Chan-ho Park, right? And so for a time, not anymore, for a time, Chan-ho Park was like the biggest thing in Korea because he was the first Korean national to make it to the top levels of baseball, the major leagues, and for a period of time he had really great success. And so if you talk to a Korean, that's what they'll basically remember about Chan-ho Park. But that's not what I remember about the guy. Since I'm a baseball fan, all these Koreans were excited about Chan-ho Park, but I was like, he's not even as good as Pedro Martinez, so what's the big deal? And he's not on the A's, so I don't really care about him, right? And I was like, it's nice that he's Korean, and I'm from Korean descent, and I'm glad a Korean dude is, doing a good. But the part that I really remember about him was, he came up in a spring training game. And for those of you who don't know baseball, spring training is preseason. These games don't count. But it was his first exposure the American baseball fans. And he made the news in a preseason game that doesn't count. And this was the piece. I remember I was watching like SportsCenter, ESPN, and they usually in SportsCenter, they only give you the highlights of some guy who hit a home run or did something spectacular on the field. But instead, they had this sequence of Chan-ho Park walking out toward the baseball field, and he goes out and he goes up to the umpire and he bows to the umpire. And then he bows to the opposite dugout, and all the American fans sitting in the crowd, And the ESPN camera looked at that and was like, what the heck is that? They just thought that was so strange. And then if you quickly panned into the crowd, and people looked confused, and at the same time they also they had this marvel on their face of like, so there's somebody who shows up at a baseball game, and he actually respects the umpire. He actually respects the umpire and shows honor to the umpire, and he actually shows honor to his opponents. And all these American fans, us, looked at that and looked at him as completely weird. But at the same time, there was this kind of surprise and beauty. Like there's something inside of our game that we get so used to just hating the umpire. I'm a baseball fan, and let me tell you something. I don't notice that dude back there except when he screws up, which is, by the way, pretty much, and of course, if he screws up against the other team, I really don't care. But of course, if he screws up against my team, I immediately start saying, hey, get some glasses, man. Like that wasn't a strike. That was a ball, and our guy should be on base. And that's pretty much my general attitude toward umps. And my general attitude to the other team is, when bad things happen to them, that's pretty much, I'm your standard average American fan, and that's how I look at the game. And yet, he was a kid. He must have been like 21 or 20. He was very young, right? And he didn't know. He didn't know you're not. It didn't take him very long to stop bowing to the ump. I mean, he just stopped doing it. He came into the kingdom of American baseball, and the kingdom of American baseball quickly beat out the values of the kingdom of Korean baseball. And so he came in from the kingdom of Korean baseball and did the things that was normal to his culture, to his kingdom, to his values. And everybody here went, what? That's so weird. What is Jesus telling us to do here? He's telling us to act like a kingdom person, a kingdom of God, not a kingdom of man person. The kingdom of man is, as I taught last week. Last week, it says, blessed are you if you're poor, and if you're hungry, and if you're weeping, and if people reject you on the account of Jesus. But actually, in the kingdom of man, it's woe to you if you're poor, and blessed are you when you're rich. Right? That's how our values work. That's how things work here in our kingdom, when it's all about us. And then the very next thing Jesus tells us to do. So first he says this thing which makes no sense to us. Blessed are you if you're poor and if you're weeping. But then he says to all of us who are interested in following him, he says this completely strange thing. Give to those who beg from you, and from one who takes away your goods, don't demand them back. What are you talking about, right? And then he says this, love your enemies and do good and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. That's what it says. I mean, in that kingdom, in that culture, you're utterly rewarded. Nobody will think you're weird. You're embraced. You're honored for giving to someone that won't ever give you anything back. In fact, they can't give you back. In fact, maybe they just hate you. So not only will they won't give you anything back, what they'll give back to you is something bad, something you don't like. And in this world, that makes no sense. It makes no sense. In some ways, it feels dangerous. And in some ways, it just feels like you're losing. That's it. It just feels like you're losing. You don't have to raise your hand. Let me just ask you this question. Have any of you ever given something to someone and you knew, you knew this ain't coming back? maybe you gave $1 to a beggar on the street. Obviously, you know it's not going to come back, right? But there are many Christians I know that say, oh, I'm not going to give to that guy because, you know, he's probably just lying to me and ripping me off. And, you know, that's probably true. Because when somebody begs from you on the street, you're not sure if they're actually beggars and they're really hurting, or whether they're just lying and they're ripping you off. My wife was, there was a commercial, and it was a portion of a news report that was going to be on the nightly news, one of the local affiliates. And this is what the story was about. There are beggars on the BART. You know, some of you take BART. You know, that public transit. It's the underground subway train that takes to San Francisco or places. And there are people who get on the BART. So they actually have to buy a ticket to get on the BART. And what do they do while they're on the BART? It's a woman and she's dressed very poorly and she actually has a baby. And she goes around, I don't know if it's her baby, but she goes around saying, we're really down and out. Would you help us? And then, so one of these news reporter folks actually followed them. And after they got off the train, then they went up to their friend who drove a Mercedes-Benz and hopped into the car. And so the report is there are these people begging on BART, and they're just ripping everybody off with lies. Wow, that's a particularly, a wild story, isn't it? Apparently that's a true story. Very recent, it's happening. And when you see something like that, you want to do a piece of kindness, but there are so many jerky people, aren't there? And deceiving, lying, instead of actually getting their money in an honest way, they would rather do it in this kind of really low-down way. And into this, Jesus says, we'll do it anyway. How about that? Has anybody ever taught this to you? Ever wrestled with this passage? I might have shared this. Years ago, when I was a teenager, I was reading, it was like the cover story of Time magazine. Back then, Time magazine was actually a real piece of journalism. And it was one of the best pieces of news magazines. It was a great news magazine, and it had really great journalism. And the cover story was about this, about poverty. And in the middle of the article, it was talking about this, that some people say, I'm not going to give to them because they're lying. They're lying, and they rip us off, and maybe they just do drugs anyway. They're just going to waste it on alcohol or drugs. And so I'm not going to give it to them. And then it was just one paragraph. I was like an 8th grader or something like this. That tells you what kind of 8th grader I was. I was a nerdy 8th grader that read Time magazine, okay? I actually wanted to read it, and I remember reading this whole article. And there was this paragraph that jumped out at me. And because the part that said, don't give to them because they'll rip you off, that's where I was. In 8th grade, I was like, yeah. We lived in a poor neighborhood, and so it wasn't like I was unfamiliar with the way, sometimes some of us have this kind of romanticized understanding of the poor. That the poor are just these hurting people, and if you're kind to them, good things will happen to them. That's not true. People who are poor, some of them are poor because they're liars and they're cheats. And because they're liars and cheats. And some of them are poor as they're liars and cheats, and they didn't become poor that way, but now because they're poor and because they're desperate, now they lie and they cheat. Sometimes it's like that. And so, since we lived in a poor neighborhood, I experienced that firsthand. You can feel all the complexity of it. This person is a genuinely wonderful person, but they're hurting. And if you give them kindness, they'll receive it with, in a good way. This person became a liar because they lived a hard life. And then this person was just a liar, and that's probably why they deserve to live a hard life. Right? You can see all of it. It's all there. That's the real reality. But here's what the paragraph said in that cover story in Time magazine. Some people who consider themselves serious Christians, or something like that, who really follow the Bible, who take the Bible seriously, the reason they give to the poor is very simple. Jesus said to do it. And that was the bottom line. That's it. And I read that, and I was convicted from Time magazine when I was in the 8th grade. Isn't that weird? I read that, and I said, it's true. I know that passage in the Bible. This is it. That is what Jesus said. He doesn't qualify it. He doesn't say, give, unless they're not ripping you off. Actually, that's what this passage is saying. Give to them, you know they're ripping you off. You know they're doing it. Give it anyway. And that makes no sense. Unless you know he's from somewhere else. And he will not accept the way things are done here. He says, you know what, I'm from this other place. I'm from another kingdom. And this is how we're going to do things. Even though it makes no sense here, this is how we're going to do it. Unless you understand that. Now let's go to part 2. This isn't easy, is it? We live in this world. And last week's message, I know, wasn't easy. I was telling one of the brothers who was wrestling with last week's sermon. I said I could have preached last week's sermon in a much more encouraging way. That, are you hungry? Are you weeping? Then know that from promise that in Jesus you will laugh. Don't think you're going to weep forever. There will be a time you're going to laugh. You're hungry now, but Jesus will feed you. God will feed you. And I could have emphasized that part of the message. That would have been nice, wouldn't it? I could have emphasized that part of the message, but most of us, I think, have to wrestle with the rich and laughing part, because we're middle class in Silicon Valley. And if we're middle class in Silicon Valley, then we have to wrestle with the fact that God does not look on riches and comfort the way we look on riches and comfort. And if we figured out how to kind of operate and in some way be comfortable in this kingdom. And in this kingdom, this is how things are, there's a certain way things are done when it comes to money and riches and comfort versus poverty and hurt. And the reason I gave last week's message is when you come to Jesus and you enter into his kingdom, there's only one way we can enter. We enter poor. That's the only way we can enter. So last week's message was that where he utterly flips upside down. Woe to you if you are rich. Woe to you who laugh. Woe to you who, you're full. Why? Because you can't come to God like that. You just can't come to God like that. Do you want to know why a lot of people in our city, why they don't go to church, or they're not even interested in church? In fact, the word that they typically use to talk about church and Christianity is irrelevant. I just don't think it's fair. I'm glad it works for you. It's a very polite way of putting it. I'm glad it works for you, but I'm not so sure it's quite relevant for me. You know what they're saying? I think the riches of the world, however the way the world could fill me, the laughter I receive from the world, the approval I receive, that's good enough. That's good enough. And if the kingdom of man can give you a riches and a feeling and a laughter that's good enough, why do you need God? Why do you even need that other kingdom? We don't need that other kingdom. This kingdom is sufficient. It's more than sufficient. So anybody who feels that way, well, Christianity, it is irrelevant. that's about as nice as you can be. It's just polite to all these goofy people who go to church and who take this weird religious book way too seriously. But if you are rich, and the example I gave you last week was Robin Williams, and yet inside you weep. I mean, the world gave you everything that it could. Robin Williams, the world gave him everything. Gave him money. They didn't just approve of him, they worshiped him. He had the houses and the money and he had the drugs, and I'm sure he probably had sex up the wazoo and all this other stuff. And of course he had laughter. He creates the laughter. And yet it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. Inside, he was hungry and he was weeping and he was poor. And if you can relate to that, now you know why we need that other kingdom. And here, someone from that other kingdom came into this kingdom. And then he was sort of like a spectacular version of Chano Park. He's like a spectacular version of Chano Park. People who hate him came up to him, and he was good to them. Lepers. Everybody rejects lepers because it's a contagious disease. Prostitutes. Obviously, what are you going to get out of them? I mean, unless you're going to give them money for sex. But that's not what he got out of them. They came up to him and they wanted to eat with them. And even though, usually everybody, you're like socially defiled. So lepers will literally make you, unclean. But prostitutes will make you socially unclean. But they come up to Jesus, and Jesus offers them meals. And he touches them in kindness. I mean, a respectable man is not even supposed to talk to strange women, let alone prostitutes. So there you go. They're the values of a whole different kingdom. This really completely crazy, spectacular version of Chano Park. Except he's not doing something, he's not operating in something as minor as baseball. He's doing everything. How do you interact with people? How do you interact with people who are hurting, with women? What is defilement? What is money? What is riches? What is power? He takes all those things, and he says, there's a whole different way of doing it. And this is how I do it. This is how we do it in the kingdom. The point I want to say is this. If you take this passage only on face value, and then you only think about this in the way we normally deal with life, and then the way we deal with what I'm calling the kingdom of man, which is just essentially worldly culture. Kingdom of man is just worldly culture. If you try to take this and then operate and then deal with this, immediately, some of you, I know you're going to think this way. So pastor, do I have to give money to that beggar guy? Is that what you're telling me? So, but lots of people are going to ask me to give, and I have to give to all of them? Is that what? So just time out here, okay? Before you ask the question, what am I supposed to do? By the way, that's a law question. You understand that? What do I have to do? That's a legalism question. And if the question you're asking me is that question, and that's the question you're asking yourself, you're thinking according to law. You're not thinking according to kingdom. I'm not asking you to think according to law, and not even telling you exactly what you're supposed to do. What I'm telling you is to think about kingdom and its values. A whole different way of operating. And before we start thinking about, do I have to do this or do I have to do that? I mean, you're probably sitting there going, Pastor, if you were at the bar, you would have known that person's ripping you off and you would have given that money, right? I probably wouldn't. If I knew that person was here, I wouldn't. Because I would say, well, how is this kindness to you when you're just a liar? Am I going to be a codependent liar for you? I'll help you to be a liar? I wouldn't if I knew it, for sure. But mostly when we know that somebody's trying to rip you off, we just avoid them or, we push them back. But maybe they need something else. See? I'm not saying I would have a solution. I'm not sure what I would do if I was being ripped off on the BART. I would hope that I would remember this passage and go, gosh, what is that? What is the value of that other kingdom? If I belong to the other kingdom. And guess what I want us to do? Do you notice this is 4 weeks in a row? And I haven't told you exactly what to do. I gave you some practical things early in the series, but we'll talk about some practicals as we get later into the series. But I don't want you to get to the practical quite yet. You know what's really, really practical? Not thinking about the practical quite yet. What's really, really practical is to ask yourself, am I poor in my heart? And do I belong in that kingdom? And if I'm in that kingdom, and when people meet me, do they think I'm weird? Because I'm not totally captured by the systems and values and the rich and poor power structures of this time. Because I just don't accept those power structures. I don't accept that way. You're probably ripping me off. I'll just be bad to you. Because in a sense, you're like my enemy. But Jesus says, do good to the person who's like an enemy. That's so strange. It's even stupid in this world. If it's all there is. We can't expect secular, unbelieving people to even operate like this. But what the legalistic person does, and of course the secular person, this is how they operate too. If they can find some nice, feel-good way of being good to other people who are hurting, and they can be absolutely certain that this will be, there's no rip-off involved, then maybe we'll do it. And if we're honest, many of us who are Christians, this is kind of how we want it to be too. We want it all kind of laid out in a nice, safe, clean way. And then we could be nice about it. And even then, what we do is we try to manage it. Because we don't want this heavy burden of actually caring for poor and hungry people and to become too big. We don't want that burden to become too big. So what we do is we have to kind of place it into a kind of manageable place and be practical. I'm not against practical. I'm very practical. And I know that we live in an intense city with a lot of push and pull on our time and our energy and our money. I'm very, very aware of that. And the last thing I want to do is stick a burden on top of your back that's supposed to break you. But believe it or not, this is a word of grace. Because really what he's trying to do is not put a back-breaking duty on our back. Really, before we even get to that, he's trying to bring a different value and a heart from a different kingdom. And you can't get into that kingdom unless you have a poverty inside. And you could be as rich as Robin Williams, but you have a poverty inside. And you have to remember that. All pieces of poverty, all people have hurt. If we can't remember that, then we're just going to sink right back into the status quo. I have money. How much of it do I have to give you? Try to be a good Christian. And then then we're not even being a Christian at all. Really, I'll just try to be a good do-gooder. I'll be a good religious person. But if we flash to a moment and remember, there was another kingdom I desperately needed. Very different. I won't say his name, but there was a brother, in our church who sent me an email and said this very personal thing. And he said last week's message really moved him because there was a time in his life when he was very poor And he felt very lost in his job and his career and pretty much felt like a failure. And there are other people, he was going to this really little church, even smaller than ours. And there were numerous stories of people like that inside the church. And his email moved me because he says, now I'm in a totally different place and I don't have to worry about food or money and, but I don't ever want to forget that that's the way I was. That's the way he put it. Now, if you have never been in a place in your life like that, where you didn't know where your next meal was going to come from, or if you felt like you were hurting and you were really low in this world, then maybe you can't entirely relate. Some of you, that is where you've been. I don't know if I've ever been quite that hungry, but I've been at some pretty low places in my life. But understand that when we come before God, we're all beggars. We're all beggars. Spiritually, that kingdom is going to be forever and ever. This economic system and the way things are here, this is just a blip. It's a blink. I mean, the younger people in our church, they already don't even know who the heck Robin Williams is. And so I have to use that weird thing. Oh, he's the voice of Aladdin. They're like, oh, that's who he is. I'm so old that I remember the first show that made Robin Williams famous. It was a show called Mork and Mindy. Anybody know the show Mork and Mindy? All right. So even then I knew this guy is weird. He was so different than anybody else on TV. And that's how old I am. But that shows you he was spectacular star, and already it's over. But there is a kingdom that will last forever. And we're going to knock on that door. I want to close with this part. Here's the verse. Love your enemies and do good. He doesn't even just say love people who rip you off, but your enemies. I mean, he makes it even harder. Love your enemies and do good and lend expecting nothing in return. Let me just stop there for a moment. Does that sound familiar to you in any way? Years ago, we were at church. My wife and I, we were living in Philadelphia. It's a church a little bigger than our church, medium-sized church, maybe 500 adults, over two services. So I think we were in the second service, which was a little larger, maybe 300. And there were teenagers up through elderly people. And it was in a lower middle class neighborhood, mostly white. And my parents were visiting me from California, and they went to church with us. And it was like the third song in the opening praise set. And the lyrics went something like this. Once your enemy, now seated at your table. I was once your enemy, but now I'm seated at your table. Jesus, thank you. Jesus, thank you. And I remember we were standing in praise, and I was standing right next to my mom. My mom was standing right there. And she sang these, and these words came up. Once your enemy, but now I'm seated at your table. Jesus, thank you. My mom is a very Presbyterian woman. She doesn't raise her hands. She generally doesn't clap. The most emotional she'll get is you'll see her, she'll close her eyes, and sometimes she'll pound her knee. When the lyrics deeply cut her to the heart. But here she stood in this church with a bunch of white folks, a large percentage of them lower middle class, poorer than her. And my mom's been a Christian for a long time. I don't even know when she became a Christian. As far as I know, she was a Christian since she was a young child. She never told me her conversion story. She's probably one of these like fell in love with Jesus when she was 3 years old. She doesn't even remember a time when she didn't believe in Jesus. That's my guess. But here is a woman, she's an upper middle class woman from California, in a church that's not her ethnicity, surrounded by lower middle class people. And the song said, once your enemy, now seated at your table. And I remember looking at my mom, and she was weeping. And her hands went up. And her hands went up. Because she may have money in this world, but deep down she could remember, this is who I am before my Savior. I was his enemy. I was his enemy. And I was really, really poor. And he invited me to his table. See? This thing that Jesus is asking us to do is just all that he has only done for us. Give to those who can't ever give back to you. Isn't that all that Jesus did? And so then he says, if you'll do this, then you'll be like sons of the Most High. Because the Son of the Most High, that is exactly what he did. He came to us who are poor, far poor, a poverty far greater than that of money. We were wretched, and we would defile him with our wickedness. And instead, he says, I will pay out far more than money. I will pay out my blood. And I will clothe you with better than, Armani or Polo. I will clothe you with my righteousness and my majesty. And once you hated me and you were my enemy, and now I invite you to my table. Even though you can never give back. And generally what you have given to me is your garbage and your hatred and your resentment and your legalism. That's basically what you've given me. But instead, I'll give you this. I want to end with this part. If you do this, then you will be like sons of the Most High. You will be like the Son of the Most High. And you will be, and your reward will be very great. Do you believe that? In Philippians chapter 2, it says that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. In other words, not money and power, but he made himself into a servant for people who could never give back to him. And for that, he was rewarded and exalted. That's how things happen in the other kingdom. That's the values of the other kingdom. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? As your pastor, I believe it and I don't believe it all the time. I believe it. I encounter somebody poor and I'm like, forget it, you're stupid. No way. And then there are times I believe it. You're just going to rip me off, aren't you? Well, I don't know. Yeah. Be a little bit more like Jesus. Can you believe it? And I hope you'll believe it. And this radically merciful Father will shower his pleasure and his rewards upon you, just like he did in Jesus. Let's pray.